Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and we are back right here, me and Brian McLaren, and we're trying to get you ready, priming the pump for your reading and conversation around part 3 of Do I Stay Christian? And this might be the hardest part, because you might decide you want to stay Christian, but then you say to yourself, Brian, how?
There you go. And I should say, Trip, when I reached the end of writing part 2, first of all, I realized there are a lot of people who are not going to stay Christian. And there are a lot of people who are. There are literally people who psychologically cannot. And there are people who psychologically cannot leave. So let's just face that reality. And then I realized a lot of people who leave think, if I could just leave Christianity, my problems would be solved. Or other people think, if I could just settle that I'm going to stay Christian, my problems would be solved. But it seems to me 5 minutes after you solve that question, then you're faced with a really interesting question, which is, how are we going to live? How shall we then live, to quote the venerable Francis Schaeffer? Or how am I going to be a human being? Because deeper than the question of Christian is, what kind of human being do I want to be? And we could get into a long theological conversation about whether that actually is what Jesus and Paul and others were really thinking about, not just a new religion, but a new humanity. Another whole subject we could explore, and I think is fascinating. But what I tried to do in part 3 is hit some of the issues that I think all of us are facing, and that in some ways are related to our identity struggle as Christians. So the first one, Include and Transcend, basically says we better take our stages of human development seriously. We better think about where we are in our own spiritual, intellectual, human development, because part of what we're struggling with when we struggle with Christian identity very often is that we're part of a Christian community that won't let us grow beyond a certain stage. It's perfectly formed to serve people in a stage. And if we move beyond that stage, it stops working for us. And then I want to move to the issue in chapter 22 of desire, because it seems to me the most formative issue for us. And I think more and more at the heart of spiritual formation is the formation of desire. What do we desire? What desires are distracting us from our deeper desires? How do we strengthen desirable desires? And like, if I were, 22 years old and looking to do a PhD, this is one of the subjects that I would really explore. And then in subsequent chapters, one of my favorite chapters to write is Rewild, because I get to share a little theory I have of language and how language becomes more real to us than the reality that it's trying to describe and point to and symbolize, and how the natural world becomes one of our ways of trying to get at something more real and bigger than language, that has something, if we believe in any kind of creator or any kind of God present in creation, that actually has a message and a logic that is trying to get through to us. And then I wrote a chapter called Find the Flow, where I'm trying to help us think about what some people call macro history, but I'm trying to say, let's take history seriously. Things are happening. How can we fit in, with that kind of flow? That's the first half of this last section. I'm interested, as you read it, any thoughts come to mind or anything you'd like to add or explore?
Yeah, I think each of them in different ways, be it thinking about stages or the nature of desires that you cultivate, but also that get cultivated in you, the way you see the world, and the way language mediates, and then in some ways gives the world always interpreted with the values in that language. Like all of these different depictions, in some way, when you go asked to go how, right, give you tools for reflecting on the practice of Christianity in ways that you address the actual engines of the problems, right? Like if we went back through number one and part one, and you look through all these issues, like what do you wish we had when we started to see how the issue of power, right, in the first section of the part one that we talked about, relating to our mother Judaism, relating to each other in the early church, getting hooked up with colonialism and imperialism. You wish we had thought, like, what does maturity and growth look like, and all these kinds of things. How what happens when the language of the church gets occupied by the language of empire? When Caesar's editors gets a hold of our theology textbooks and our prayer books, like you ask these things, and so many times when you say, I want to say yes for all the beautiful reasons in part 2, but if you don't take the time to dig in, it's like you're re-engaging with a powerful family system in the heart of Western Christianity. And it takes interventions into it to deal with the toxic power of the relations. A lot of people believe, now it's not surprising Tripp says this, but a lot of people believe the real problems are things and not relations. And so you can point at the problem and you're like, maybe we should cut that out. Get rid of that doctrine or that practice or whatever. You start cutting substances out because you think if you can point at the problem and get rid of it, now we fixed it. And one of the things I think we have this growing awareness of, and something you and I've talked about before, is it's actually the network of relations that's the problem. So how do we have interventions into the practice and community of faith and the way this community relates to the communities around us? So you have a more healthy, vibrant faith that the next generation, when it learns its language, the next generation, when those desires get embedded in them, it's a more beautiful, life-giving expression, maybe one that coheres deeply with all the reasons we said yes. And I think recognizing the tools that gives can really help an individual and definitely a group go, you take each of the how chapters and go, then how could we practice transcending and including? How could we examine unexamined desires in us or cultivate particular desires? And then you become intentional about the health of relations that you live in and will get passed on, be it to your family, but also to the community of faith that you participate in and such. So, I mean, that's those 4 chapters in particular. That's what pops up.
Oh, thanks. And actually, that helps me better understand what I was trying to do here, because I hope people get this feeling as they read it, that as I reflect at any rate on what's not working in so many sectors of Christianity, it's very similar things that are not working in government and not working in economics. And it's this pervasive thing that we need to outgrow and move beyond and learn our lessons from, but move on to something else. And that becomes, it's a practical matter because we're not living in a vacuum. We're living in the thing that's the problem. Those are the first 4. I'll just mention the other 4. In fact, when you just said that part of our problem is we have this idea, if we could just cut something out and throw it away, that would solve the problem. And chapter 25 is called Reconsecrate Everything. And it begins with a quote from Annie Leonard, "There is no away. We can't cut something out and throw it away." It's still part of our world. And we have to figure out, how do we have a redemptive, healing relationship, even to the things that are problematic? And then building on that, in chapter 26, it's called Renounce and Announce. And I talk about this in many ways. To me, the model of this is the coming out process that the LGBT community has modeled, this point in life where people say, look, I've assumed something about myself, or you've assumed something about me, and it's time to let you know that's not the case anymore. And that process isn't a way of saying, I hate you and I don't want to relate to you anymore, or I want you to hate me. It's a way of saying, our relationship is about to change, and I want to be as direct and clear about that as possible. So that's another part of the how, I think, for us to be constructively different, whether we continue to identify as Christian or not. And then the last 2 chapters, in many ways, move a little bit more, even in a kind of contemplative direction, as they talk about staying loyal to reality. And I think we all feel this right now, because with this rise in conspiracy theories, watching QAnon rhetoric taking over huge sectors of white evangelicalism in America and in other countries, this sense among people that they'd be happy to live in a fantasy land if it's one that makes them feel good. This sense that we need practices to help us not get sucked into a fantasy land and into a confirmation bias Disneyland, but to try to actually stay in touch with something that's going to be real, whether we believe it's there or not. And then the last chapter about staying human is this, in some ways, trying to bring things together to suggest that ultimately, what we need is not just a new religion, but a new model of humanity. And and that sets the stage for some of the practical issues I deal with in the appendix, and we can come back to that. But those last four, anything you'd like to say about those? Trish?
Yeah. Okay. So I have a question that I think is related to it, but I really want to know what you think. Early in the larger kind of like emerging conversation, people got confused or frustrated with all the baggage that comes with Christian and want to set it aside. So I'm a follower of Jesus. You write generous orthodoxy. And then you pick up a whole bunch of labels from all the different parts and looking at different expressions of the church and going like, what are the parts of all this part of the body of Christ I identify with and want to celebrate? Yeah. And in this book, you ask, do I stay Christian? And it's not the label and the debates around the label that's there. It's these kind of responses are the how. I wonder if the way you wrote this book, and in particular the second half, it comes from insights you learned having spent time where we debated labels. I mean, and even say there was a time where like, oh, are you missional or not? Or, I mean, think of all the labels we spent time on. Those are labels, and these are practices or, ways of relating.
I often tell the story of this was really a significant dinner in my life when I was having dinner with Richard Rohr. I don't know, this is close to 20 years ago, early 2000s. And we're in this little Mexican restaurant, as I recall, in San Diego. And we're just catching up. And Richard says, I'm starting to think that I've invested most of my life trying to teach people a new theology when I didn't teach them a new way of seeing and thinking, that the new theology requires a new way of seeing and thinking. And of course, he calls that contemplative or non-dual. He has a lot of different terms to describe it. And he basically said, because if I give people new ideas and they just plug it into the old way of thinking, we don't get where we need to be. And that's where practices come in. That's where practices come in to help us to actually not just plug in new ideas and old ways of thinking, but actually help us practice new ways of seeing and new ways of thinking and new ways of holding. So, I remember when I was literally a teenager in the Jesus movement, and I heard big debates between charismatics and Calvinists. And my only option at that stage of my development was to figure out which one was right, who were right. Because I couldn't articulate this. Maybe if I could go back in time and sit down with myself, I could have seen it if someone patiently explained it to me. But the real question for me is, whose team am I going to join? And each team required full buy-in to their system and full opposition to the other system. And then it takes years, it takes decades where you begin to see, you know what? I don't want to buy into either one of those teams on the terms that they're allowing me to buy in. And there's this ability to start to say, I'd like to be able to be critically appreciative of both. Well, that's a skill. And at any rate, that's part of what I think is this shift that I was not capable of helping anybody else see, because I was only in the process of trial and error of kind of figuring it out myself.
Yeah, and the other side of that, I think, in thinking about the practices, and then not having a debate about finding a new label, is that part of saying yes to staying Christian in our historical moment, recognizing the amount of power and people that both exist within the church and will be impacted by it, is that once you decide not to abandon it, then it seems less than ideal to forsake the body whole and then carve your little niche. And so when you cultivate practices or the kind of contemplative practices or investment in more beautiful communities and these kinds of things, you're giving people the opportunity to see themselves and their neighbor and their enemy and their creaturely neighbors as the divine does. And I think
Yes.
that is ultimately going to be more compelling. And you know what? It stuck out to me thinking when I grew up Baptist, we did not have confirmation because the Holy Ghost did it. And then we got baptized and after your confession of faith. But when I worked at two large mainline Protestant churches, one a Disciples of Christ Church and one UCC, I ended up in charge of confirmation. And I realized that most of the confirmation for these are theological. And I have to say, nothing makes a 15-year-old more excited to go to church an extra time a week for a year, like fill in the blank worksheets around theology.
So you have the right answers. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking through my own, life growing up, and what animated me and made me stay were when other people looked at me with the love I came to know later God had for me.
Yes.
When others treated you in ways that you started to trust the experience of that God mediated through them. And so I thought, well, I don't want to suck at my job, so we're going to do this differently. And throughout when I do confirmation for the whole year, the big glass bowl, like a fish bowl, it's a big God bowl, and people have to bring a really good question every week, and I always run over and never answer them. So you go through the whole year of confirmation, never answering it. But when you begin confirmation, do a spiritual retreat and stuff, learn Lectio and all those like basic things. At the end, you go, do you want to do an experiment this year where we attempt to live as if Jesus invites us into a compelling way of being to give your life to, right? Yes. And then each 6 or 7 weeks, we create an experiment on a teaching of Jesus. And what's amazing to me, and if we want to come back to it in all the live sessions, I can give examples. But the crazy thing about those type of experiments is by the year of doing them, at the last week, I just pulled out the bowl and read the question. Does anyone still have this question? Nope. No. So like you can guess, like, does Gandhi go to hell? I don't know. We spent 8 weeks praying for our enemy. Anyone still worried about this one? No. Right. You could just go through them.
Oh my goodness.
And now as a professional theologian, I want any of the nerds to ask, like, what's the specific vocab? How does this work out? I'm happy to give exegetical examples and people from church history to be your heroes. But what made it compelling was a community where you learned what it's like for a community to see you through these practices. It generates desires in you. And then when you learn to trust that experience, it becomes more compelling. And I think that what you said was so striking, and it's dumbfounding to me that those of us that have had to wrestle with it with youth ministry, no one ends up thinking maybe the way to rejuvenate the congregational life is actually not to do the fix the labels, get real clear on these specific things. It's actually to create the very space where this reality gets practiced and experienced. And then you start to see the world through these desires, through these stories and such. And anyway, that's one of the reasons I really like the how. Even though, I probably underline more of your theology statements in other books. I'm like, good. I'm glad Brian agrees with me on this one.
But, Tripp, it strikes me as you say that with the hundreds of millions of words that you have read in theology textbooks and the millions of pages you've turned and thought about, what that act of theological reflection and thinking has brought you to is the sense that what this is about is in not to the exclusion of the other, but at the heart is introducing people to a set of practices, to a way of living, a way of seeing, a way of interacting, a way of relating. Because when you are brought into that way of relating, it helps you see things in new ways. It helps you see through things that need to be seen through. It helps you see into things that need to be seen into. And I think this is part of what Christian faith may become on the other side. Like we may, a significant number of us may actually rediscover this is why Jesus invited people to follow him for 3 years so they could watch his way of life and pick up, catch that set of practices so that you encounter a leper, here's how you respond. You encounter someone who hates you and criticizes you, here's how you respond. You encounter people who want to put nails through your hands and feet, here's how you respond. And there's this thing that happens to you when you see the world this way. To me, this is part of, I think, the foment of what's going on, and why when many people think I want to leave Christianity, they're saying there's something better that I'm actually not getting here. And maybe we'll actually start grappling a little more deeply toward that getting better, which interestingly, in one of the things, the first appendix is how to get the most out of this book. And I'm trying to give people a method of reading the book, which is in a way what we're trying to do through this course. We're trying to invite people to not just say the purpose of reading this book is to get ideas, but the purpose of reading this book is to have some experiences and enter into some relationships and do some interaction with people. I also, in the second appendix, is a kind of addendum to chapter 2, where I just wanted to give people a quick survey of the torture methods used by the Christian church. And this could be a 400-page book. I mean, when you start digging more deeply into it, and then you find more and more examples that lead you to specific practices of torture by religious authorities in South America or in the United States. I was just hearing about how there was a period of time in European history because to be infertile meant was a grounds for divorce. You could divorce your wife if she was infertile because she had sort of a moral obligation to bear you children, since married men were the people of power. That there were courts and church functions to sit by people's beds to make sure they had an erection, in men's beds, to see if they had an erection at night, or to actually observe people having intercourse to see if it was the man's fault or the woman's fault that, fertilization wasn't happening. I mean, some pretty crazy stuff in our history, right? But it's a practice of facing these facts and not shying away from them or minimizing them or denying them. That is part of what I think helps us grow. And then I have 2 little letters, really, or specific appendices. One, helping people think about staying in their denomination, because sometimes people say, there might be other parts of Christianity, other pastures in Christianity, other mansions in Christianity where there'd be room for me, but maybe not this one. And then a special letter to pastors, because I think pastors who are struggling with their Christian identity have a special role to play in the middle of all this. And having been a pastor myself, this is a special concern of mine. So that's how in a sense, the appendices are an extension of that how section.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. And one of the questions that I get quite often that, if you wrote another letter, would be for the person who wants to say yes, and when they want to figure out how, and then they can't find a community in the part of the, in the city they live in, or the town they're in, or the part of the country they're in. And that's a very different challenge than those in leadership, or trying to figure out if there's this place in this denomination and they have other options. Part of that response was like us deciding to do this in a way that people can use it in individual as a individual, and then interact with us live each Sunday night as we go through, and people could use it in a group and their conversations frame it. Right. But I mean, do you have encouragement for those who, put a good faith effort at finding the community to answer the how question with?
Well, actually, that's maybe a good way to sort of end this conversation. Let me give a couple and then see if you have some additional ones. But the thing I would say is people are figuring it out. It really is a problem. Like, you can live in states in the United States where you'd have to drive 4 or 5 hours to find even one small community where your questions would be welcome. I wish we were at a different place, but we just aren't. And I'm sure that's true in different parts of the world. I was in the little country of Burundi, one of the poorest, probably 4th or fifth poorest country in the world, if not even lower in number than that. And I'll never forget a fellow came up to me after I was at some event. He taught at a Bible college. And he told me how many young people were dropping out of churches, and that a big part of his work was that none of these groups knew each other, but there were groups of 5 people here and 15 people here and 16 people here around the capital city of Bujumbura who had these secret groups where they had dropped out of churches, but they'd formed these little groups, and they found out that he was a theologian who would help them with their questions. And he said, I just do a circuit where I'm going around to all these different groups, totally self-organizing, and the word would spread. And there are analogies to that around the world. And but a lot of them happen online, like we're doing. And I think for so many people, the Wittenberg door of today is podcasts, because a person's driving down the car, alone in the car, and they're listening to a conversation, and they blush because they know, if anybody at my church knew I was listening to this conversation, I would be shamed and embarrassed and edged out. Thank God, within this little cell, it's the monastic cell on wheels going 65 miles an hour down the highway, I'm able to be at least an eavesdropper, and then through events like this, a conversation partner in these important developments.
No, I definitely think that podcasts are playing part of that role. And one of the, in some sense, I feel too frequent, but always amusing emails are when people tell me they are in a choir, but listen to the podcast while the sermon's on, because they're like, I've been a part of this group. I have a small group, and it's the edgy small group at our church. And we do some really cool stuff in the community, and they love our family. But the minister, and it's almost always a he's just insert thing. So yeah. I'm in the choir, but I listen to the podcast while he's preaching. And which, I think we'd love for people to have not have that as an issue, but we are definitely in a time of transition where, while this is happening, you also have cultural institution fear and dread and a lack of trust. And then you have like all the growing kind of tribalism and partisanship and economic contraction. And there's so many parts of this historical moment that are applying lots of pressure on people. And so knowing that, my response would be like, give yourself a break if you haven't found something in the moment, and learn to love the bits you have. And then if you run into or connect with someone that are considering starting something, realize that if you're a part of supporting it and being a part of it, be it in person or an online space and things, that there's tons of other people that are feeling that way. So last year we had like 4.5 million downloads of Homebrewed. And when I've done surveys and things, about 25-30% are actively engaged in a local community of faith. And a decent number of those are ministers. Of those that aren't, a lot of them wish they were.
Yes.
And those that aren't sure they'll ever find one, these are all people that choose to listen to 1.5 hour interviews of me and a theologian. So, this isn't like it was like spiritual hour. This is like the guy that has multiple books on Jesus before he's 40, talking to other academics. So I say that just to go, like, most people, like you mentioned, like no one knows what they're listening to. But my hunch is that some of the people next to you that you think would be scared for you to tell the truth and share your story also feel the same way. And so one of the, when we've done live Homebrewed events or those kinds of things, you could see people like, like one of the last ones before lockdown, I was doing a live event in the Southeast. Let's just do that vague, in a big city next to almost nothing, everything around it. Live podcast. There's probably like 100 or so people in this brewery and a couple professors sponsored by a seminary. And after it, there's like a group of 35 to 45-year-old dressed like they're clearly are ministers. And they all had known each other from seminary, never admitted they listened to the podcast, thought they'd get fired if the other one saw them there. And then since then have become friends and are like, we're all in these communities. How do we actually make faith so that we would want to go to the churches we work at?
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
So it could even be the ministers. So like if you're at a place, what's the worst the minister could say if you're honest and tell them the question, like go away maybe. But like if you've already internalized it, that's other thing. Like I just think the critical mass is growing of people that all that we talked about, like in the how. And the reasons to say yes, there's a critical mass that that soon I think will be more and more organized. And the hope, at least for me, is that as more communities form of people that share that, the number of people who say no because they've been harmed by the body of Christ goes down. Like there are tons of intellectual reasons. There are beautiful other faiths. There are a ton. I don't want to make everyone say yes, but I do think we should be concerned about those that say no to Christianity because the body of Christ hasn't acted like Christ. And anyway, that's my encouragement for that group. So just one last comment on that. So you think just the creativity that's happening, and I think we have to acknowledge it. So, a lot of people used to go to church for 1 hour a week, 52 weeks a year. But now there are things like Greenbelt, Wild Goose Festival, Theology Beer Camp. And in a sense, people go for 52 hours once a year for some multi-day event, right? And take that from that through all the different things we're talking about to people who still can't find one other person or aren't ready yet to go public. And they're just dipping their toes in. And for right now, all that's happening is they're reading books or they're listening to a podcast. And all of this is part of the process. And wherever people are in this process, I guess if I can say this as an act of faith, for a person to dare to believe that where they are is okay and that God is with them there and that they don't have to rush out of wherever they are as fast as possible, but to accept that there are things that are happening to them, things they're learning wherever they are in this process. And some of this, it's not going to be over ever ultimately, but some of the mess we're in right now may last all of our lifetimes. And so we're going to be in these interim positions. And that's all, and it's all good. We don't have to be embarrassed about it. In fact, we can just say, oh, this is kind of interesting that I get to live in a time like this. Yeah. Well, thank you, Brian. I'm super excited to be doing this with you and can't wait to hear from everyone that are in reading groups or you're doing it by yourself and anything in between. You can send us your questions. And remember, if it's about specific things in the book, you can name the passage and things. And then that helps me corner Brian. And I can even use, if I need to, like a real aggressive tone, Brian. Like if they're worried about something, I could be like, Brian McLaren. Like I could do it like that and see how you handle it because you're really good at it. But let us know. You'll be able to interact online. You can use it in a small group. And we're just totally excited to get to hang out on Sunday nights with everyone doing this. So thank you for joining. And Brian and I look forward to hanging out on the interwebs with you as we engage the book together.